March of 1892, 3 black grocery store owners in Memphis, Tennessee were murdered by a mob of white men. Lynchings like these were happening all over the American South, often without any subsequent legal investigation or consequences for the murderers. But this time, a young journalist and friend of the victims set out to expose the truth about these killings. Her reports would shock the nation and launch her career as an investigative journalist, civic leader, and civil rights advocate. Her name was Ida B. Wells. Ida Bell Wells was born into slavery in Holly Springs, Mississippi on July 16, 1862, several months before the Emancipation Proclamation released her and her family. After losing both parents and a brother to yellow fever at the age of 16, she supported her 5 remaining siblings by working as a school teacher in Memphis, Tennessee. During this time, she began working as a journalist. Writing under the pen name Iola, by the early 1890s, she gained a reputation as a clear voice against racial injustice and became co-owner and editor of the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight newspaper. She had no shortage of material. In the decades following the Civil War, Southern whites attempted to reassert their power by committing crimes against black people, including suppressing their votes, vandalizing their businesses, and even murdering them. After the murder of her friends, Wells launched an investigation into lynching. She analyzed specific cases through newspaper reports and police records, and interviewed people who had lost friends and family to lynch mobs. She risked her life to get this information. As a black person investigating racially motivated murders, she enraged many of the same Southern white men involved in lynchings. Her bravery paid off. Most whites had claimed and subsequently reported that lynchings were responses to criminal acts by black people. But that was not usually the case. Through her research, Wells showed that these murders were actually a deliberate, brutal tactic to control or punish black people who competed with whites. Her friends, for example, had been lynched when their grocery store became popular enough to divert business from a white competitor. Wells published her findings in 1892. In response, a white mob destroyed her newspaper presses. She was out of town when they struck, but they threatened to kill her if she ever returned to Memphis. So she traveled to New York, where that same year she republished her research in a pamphlet titled Southern Horrors: Lynch Law in All Its Phases. In 1895, after settling in Chicago, she built on Southern Horrors in a longer piece called The Red Record. Her careful documentation of the horrors of lynching and impassioned public speeches drew international attention. Wells used her newfound fame to amplify her message. She traveled to Europe, where she rallied European outrage against racial violence in the American South, in hopes that the U.S. government and public would follow their example. Back in the U.S., she didn't hesitate to confront powerful organizations, fighting the segregationist policies of the YMCA and leading a delegation to the White House to protest discriminatory workplace practices. She did all of this while disenfranchised herself. Women didn't win the right to vote until Wells was in her late 50s. And even then, the vote was primarily extended to white women only. Wells was a key player in the battle for voting inclusion, starting a black women's suffrage organization in Chicago. But in spite of her deep commitment to women's rights, she clashed with white leaders of the movement. During a march for women's suffrage in Washington, D.C., she ignored the organizers' attempt to placate Southern bigotry by placing black women in the back and marched up front alongside the white women. She also chafed with other civil rights leaders who saw her as a dangerous radical. She insisted on airing, in full detail, the atrocities taking place in the South, while others thought doing so would be counterproductive to negotiations with white politicians. Although she participated in the founding of the NAACP, she was soon sidelined from the organization. Wells' unwillingness to compromise any aspect of her vision of justice shined a light on the weak points of the various rights movements and ultimately made them stronger, but also made it difficult for her to find a place within them. She was ahead of her time, waging a tireless struggle for equality and justice, decades before many had even begun to imagine it possible. If you were inspired by Ida B. Wells' fight for equality, check out this playlist for more videos about influential women throughout history. On August 28, 1963, Martin Luther King Jr. delivered his I Have a Dream speech at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. That day, nearly 250,000 people gathered on the National Mall to demand an end to the discrimination, segregation, violence, and economic exclusion Black people still faced across the United States. None of it would have been possible without the march's chief organizer, a man named Bayard Rustin. Rustin grew up in a Quaker household and began peacefully protesting racial segregation in high school. He remained committed to pacifism throughout his life and was jailed in 1944 as a conscientious objector to World War II. During his 2-year imprisonment, he protested the segregated facilities from within. Wherever Rustin went, he organized and advocated, and was constantly attuned to the methods, groups, and people who could help further messages of equality. He joined the Communist Party when Black American civil rights were one of its priorities, but soon became disillusioned by the party's authoritarian leanings and left. In 1948, he traveled to India to learn the peaceful resistance strategies of the recently assassinated Mahatma Gandhi. He returned to the United States armed with strategies for peaceful protest, including civil disobedience. He began to work with Martin Luther King Jr. in 1955 and shared these ideas with him. As King's prominence increased, Rustin became his main advisor, as well as a key strategist in the broader civil rights movement. He brought his organizing expertise to the 1956 bus boycotts in Montgomery, Alabama. In fact, he had organized and participated in a transportation protest that helped inspire the boycotts almost a decade before. His largest-scale organizing project came in 1963 when he led the planning for the National March on Washington. The possibility of riots that could injure marchers and undermine their message of peaceful protest was a huge concern. Rustin not only worked with the D.C. police and hospitals to prepare, but organized and trained a volunteer force of 2,000 security marshals. In spite of his deft management, some of the other organizers did not want Rustin to march in front with other leaders from the South because of his homosexuality. Despite these slights, Rustin maintained his focus, and on the day of the march, he delivered the marchers' demands in a speech directed at President John F. Kennedy. The march itself proceeded smoothly, without any violence. It has been credited with helping pass the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which ended segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination, and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which outlawed discriminatory voting practices. In spite of his decades of service, Rustin's positions on certain political issues were unpopular among his peers. Some thought he wasn't critical enough of the Vietnam War, or that he was too eager to collaborate with the political establishment, including the president and Congress. Others were uncomfortable with his former communist affiliation. But ultimately, both his belief in collaboration with the government and his membership to the Communist Party had been driven by his desire to maximize tangible gains and liberties for Black Americans, and to do so as quickly as possible. Rustin was passed over for several influential roles in the 1960s and 70s, but he never stopped his activism. In the 1980s, he publicly came out as gay and was instrumental in drawing attention to the AIDS crisis until his death in 1987. In 2013, 50 years after the March on Washington, President Barack Obama posthumously awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, praising Rustin's march towards true equality, no matter who we are or who we love. Bayard Rustin famously said that every community needs a group of angelic troublemakers, people willing to stand up and speak out against the status quo. Over the course of the 1960s, the FBI amassed almost 2,000 documents in an investigation into one of America's most celebrated minds. The subject of this inquiry was a writer named James Baldwin. At the time, the FBI investigated many artists and thinkers, but most of their files were a fraction of the size of Baldwin's. During the years when the FBI hounded him, he became one of the best-selling Black authors in the world. So what made James Baldwin loom so large in the imaginations of both the public and the authorities? Born in Harlem in 1924, he was the oldest of 9 children. At age 14, he began to work as a preacher. By delivering sermons, he developed his voice as a writer, but also grew conflicted about the church's stance on racial inequality and homosexuality. After high school, he began writing novels and essays while taking a series of odd jobs. But the issues that had driven him away from the church were still inescapable in his daily life. Constantly confronted with racism and homophobia, he was angry and disillusioned and yearned for a less restricted life. So in 1948, at the age of 24, he moved to Paris on a writing fellowship. From France, he published his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, in 1953. Set in Harlem, the book explores the church as a source of both repression and hope. It was popular with both black and white readers. As he earned acclaim for his fiction, Baldwin gathered his thoughts on race, class, culture, and exile in his 1955 extended essay, Notes of a Native Son. Meanwhile, the civil rights movement was gaining momentum in America. Black Americans were making incremental gains at registering to vote and voting, but were still denied basic dignities in schools, on buses, in the workforce, and in the armed services. Though he lived primarily in France for the rest of his life, Baldwin was deeply invested in the movement and keenly aware of his country's unfulfilled promise. He had seen family, friends, and neighbors spiral into addiction, incarceration, and suicide. He believed their fates originated from the constraints of a segregated society. In 1963, he published The Fire Next Time, an arresting portrait of racial strife in which he held white America accountable. But he also went further, arguing that racism hurt white people too. In his view, everyone was inextricably enmeshed in the same social fabric. He had long believed that people are trapped in history, and history is trapped in them. Baldwin's role in the civil rights movement went beyond observing and reporting. He also traveled through the American South, attending rallies, giving lectures of his own. He debated both white politicians and black activists, including Malcolm X, and served as a liaison between black activists and intellectuals and white establishment leaders like Robert Kennedy. Because of Baldwin's unique ability to articulate the causes of social turbulence in a way that white audiences were willing to hear, Kennedy and others tended to see him as an ambassador for black Americans, a label Baldwin rejected. And at the same time, his faculty with words led the FBI to view him as a threat. Even within the civil rights movement, Baldwin could sometimes feel like an outsider for his choice to live abroad, as well as his sexuality, which he explored openly in his writing at a time when homophobia ran rampant. Throughout his life, Baldwin considered it his role to bear witness. Unlike many of his peers, he lived to see some of the victories of the civil rights movement, but the continuing racial inequalities in the United States weighed heavily on him. Though he may have felt trapped in his moment in history, his words have made generations of people feel known, while guiding them toward a more nuanced understanding of society's most complex issues. Learn about other trailblazers of the civil rights movement with these videos.